Siege Survival Gloria Victis, the medieval siege simulator game that released just a few days ago. This one took me by surprise. I made a video at the start of the year listing all of the historical games I was looking forward to, but I missed this off the list because I wasn't even aware it existed. So now I'm going to make up for that. Here's my breakdown of the game so you can work out whether it's worth your time to play, and also at the end I'll mention the really interesting historical aspect to this game that I think makes it special. So let's get into it. I've created chapters for this video which you can check out below, so you can jump to the section that interests you the most should you want. Straight off the bat, this game features the lesser spotted free demo, where you can play the prologue of the game, so you can download it and see if you like it. And hats off to the developer for having the confidence in their game to offer a demo. This should happen way more than it does. The game takes place in a fortified medieval town that's just been assaulted and overrun by a hostile foreign army. You control a team of up to 4 civilians living in the town's keep, which so far has resisted the enemy attack and is under siege, and your main objective is to support the remnants of the town's army as they repel the siege. If the attackers break through, it's game over. The soldiers that are camped out in the bastion need a constant supply of food, water, medical items, arms and armour, all of which you can scavenge or craft. The fewer of these things they have, the worse they'll be at stopping the enemy onslaughts and recovering from them. There's 2 halves to the gameplay. By day, you're in the keep constructing buildings to process raw materials or to grow food or to repair equipment, and at night you send out one of your team to scavenge resources from the town, being sure to avoid enemy patrols as you go, or just blindly running through them like I did. Periodically, the enemy will attempt to assault the keep. The action takes place off-screen, although you might have to dodge some incoming missile attacks, or cows, and after each battle you get a breakdown of how your side fared and what they need to continue the fight. The core gameplay is all about balancing scant resources to keep your civilians alive, or at least well enough to function, and keeping the soldiers in the bastion supplied so you're not overrun. The game also has a quite well done story with various different encounters scattered throughout the town map. Sometimes you'll have to make decisions which can impact you both positively and negatively. You can recruit different civilians to your cause, each with their own stats throughout a playthrough. I've come across 7 so far, so there's a good amount of replayability as you can have 4 at a time. The game also offers different starting scenarios for playthroughs. There's also a scenario editor, which I haven't tried, but it looks pretty in-depth. The tone is pretty dark, which I like, but some reviewers have complained about. But, I mean, if this is your cover art, it's not exactly going to be a picnic, is it? It's a fairly hard and unforgiving game, which uses an autosave rather than manual saves, making it a bit of a roguelike experience, although you can revert to older saves by day if you want to. But you'll constantly be under pressure during most playthroughs. You just won't have enough resources to do everything you want, and that's kind of the point. Siege Survival has a core of gameplay that I really like, although the peripheries are often a little bit rough. The stealth mechanics are fairly shallow, and there isn't really enough of a threat from enemy patrols for my liking. If you mess up, you can just set your character to run straight back to the castle without too many consequences. The UI is clunky. I'd sum it up by saying it's trickier than it should be to get your characters to do what you want them to do half the time. And talking of the characters, they lack depth. They're introduced with a bit of interesting background story and then they're sort of forgotten about. The pace of the game can be pretty unrelenting if, like me, you have the reaction times of a tired sloth, and there's no pause. So I had to slow the game speed down to the lower setting, so everything looked like it was in the Matrix, to try and stay on top of all the stuff I wanted to do, especially when you have 4 characters running about. One of the game's challenges is working out exactly how to create the resources you need, and often the solutions are not obvious and there's a bit of trial and error. If you're anything like me, you're probably going to fail your first playthrough. This game obviously takes a lot of inspiration from This War of Mine, which I'll come back to later, and features more genres than a well-stocked library. It's a blend of crafting, survival, base building, stealth, and strategy, with a Bernard Cornwell novel thrown in for good measure. That all creates a really refreshing game that's better than the sum of its parts and kind of becomes addictive once you understand the mechanics. You'll constantly be planning stuff to do and find yourself wanting to play just one more day or just one more night to try and get the resources you need. It's a really good gameplay loop. As usual on this channel, this is not your average video about games. Let's have a look at some of the history that's inspired the game because, as I mentioned in the intro, I think that's what makes this game stand out from a lot of others. The invading army is clearly inspired by the Vikings and the raids of settlements along the English coast during the 8th to 11th century, although the armour and architecture of the buildings, as well as the inclusion of things like trebuchets, merges this with much later medieval history. The game world and the protagonists are fictional, but it gives you enough of a flavour of medieval history to immerse you without being stuck in one real-world location or time. A core part of Siege Survival is that the player feels immersed in the situation, and for that to work, games like this rely on the player having some kind of an emotional connection to the setting and the characters, and I personally always find that easier with games with an historical setting. It's something about the idea that something like this might have happened to real people at some point in the past. Coming back to the influence of This War of Mine, which is a game itself inspired by the events of the Siege of Sarajevo, what I really like in that game and this game is that it features the kind of history that is just not covered by most games. The untold story of the millions of ordinary people affected by grand historical events in the past. I did my undergraduate dissertation on the siege of a small English town, albeit during the English Civil War, a good few hundred years after the setting of this game, but it was filled with first-hand accounts, some copies of which I still have, of how ordinary civilians suffered and survived, or didn't, through these big military campaigns. For a game market saturated with historical games focusing on combat, it's really refreshing that Siege Survival doesn't directly feature any. Don't get me wrong, I love combat in games, some of my favourite games are based on it, turn-based, RTS, first person, but there does seem to be a lack of historical games that are fun to play, but where combat is not a direct part of the experience. It just takes a bit more imagination from the game developers to create the kind of setting where combat is not required, but the game is still engaging. And that's why I really like this game. For all its shortcomings, the unique setting and context for me more than makes up for them. The answer to the question of whether you should buy this is if you think, well actually, the answer to that question is play the demo and find out. But if you think the setting and immersion will make up for some of the rough edges, it's definitely worth buying. And I'd say it's pretty flippin' reasonable at just under 17 quid, or your regional equivalent. So thanks for watching, I'm off for another dose of medieval-inspired misery. Thanks for indulging my ramblings and thoughts on this game. See you in the next video.